Hey all, Grimrukh here, with a new and long overdue update on Dark Souls Nightfall. As you'll see today, a lot has changed in Nightfall, and while we can't give you a new release date yet, I do hope to give you a sense of how the project has transformed in the last year. Here's a nice long look behind the scenes. One of the points I emphasized in our last update was that the world map for Nightfall was essentially complete, and that we were focusing on NPC questlines, general polish, and new bosses. But then my Blender tools for Dark Souls map editing started getting pretty serious. I realized that I now had much more control over rebuilding the world of Lordran than ever before. And the more I looked at Nightfall's world, let's call it Nightfall 1.0, the more I realized how much it was lagging behind our new map modding abilities. The design of game progression and the story it told was solid, and the layout of basic enemies and items within each area was mostly fine, but I now saw that in order to connect those areas into one cohesive world, I had made a deal with the devil. Nightfall started in November 2019, when AinTunez came to me with a simple sounding mod idea. He'd just played through Katana Zero and wanted to make a mod for Dark Souls 1 that transformed the combat system into something more fast-paced, faster even than Bloodborne or Dark Souls 3. It sounded pretty sweet to me, so I signed up to build a new world around that core mechanic. Meowmaritus quickly joined to implement the new combat, Dane Brennand on models, Zullie on story editing, and so on. It might sound wild in a universe that now includes massive overhaul projects like Dark Souls 3 Archthrones, but the idea of building a new world in any of From Software's games was extremely daunting in 2019 and 2020. Naturally, there was the physical effort that would be required to design, model, and texture new map assets, which would obviously be the bare minimum required, but the boogeyman looming over the whole idea was nav meshes. We sort of knew what was going on inside FromSoft's old NVM navmesh file format for Dark Souls 1, but there were no 3D editors for it. And then there were these strange, seemingly critical extra map files that were definitely important for enemy movement, navigation, and possibly more, but we'll come back to those. I still wanted to do something with the maps, so we settled on a compromise. The world of Nightfall would take the game's existing maps, entire game areas like Darkroot Garden, Undead Burg, and Demon Ruins, which keep their assets in separate single game folders, and were generally connected by narrow tunnels and corridors in the world, and I would simply rearrange them. This way, the only edits we'd theoretically need to make to map piece models, Havoc collisions, and FromSoft's nav meshes would at least be limited to just a number of new connection points between areas. Collisions were painful to edit, but not impossible thanks to resident wizard Dropoff, and if we couldn't figure out how to edit the nav meshes without breaking the whole enemy navigation system, then that was fine. Enemies just wouldn't be able to follow you between maps, which they rarely do anyway. And that's what we did. Almost all of our changes to map assets were focused on new connections between maps, awkwardly gluing together corridors and tunnels that had previously led elsewhere. If you've played the demo, you've already seen this in action at the new connection between the Demon Ruins and Darkroot Garden. Back in the day, even just this one connection was a lot of work by Dropoff and myself, thanks to the awkward model editing pipeline. But it eventually worked. And then the problems started creeping in. Problem 1. Colliding worlds. When designing the layout of Nightfall 1.0, I was extremely constricted by the options for connection points. A connection at an existing doorway or tunnel entrance, for example, had to occur at a very specific angle and position. These precise angles fully determined the relative positions of the entire connected maps. Unfortunately, this left us with very few degrees of freedom beyond looking at each isolated pair of maps. As more and more of these new restricted connections were put in place, massive conflicts started to appear between different overlapping areas. Have a look at Crystal Cave and Darkroot Garden in Nightfall 1.0. In terms of how long it took to walk from one to the other in-game, these two areas were nowhere near each other, but due to sheer bad luck, the chain of connections between them had caused them to end up in very similar world positions. But it gets even worse. Darkroot Garden was connected to the Duke's Archives, which is in the same map as Crystal Cave. This means that both the Archives and Crystal Cave had to be loaded at the same time. This is fine for visual map pieces, because we could just use specific draw groups to ensure Crystal Cave was never visible from Darkroot and vice versa. But what about collisions? Well, I wrote some event scripts that manually disabled all of the Crystal Cave collisions while the player was standing in Darkroot Garden, and vice versa. In Nightfall 1.0, this kind of fix, and by golly are there some serious air quotes around that, was everywhere. And it did kind of work, to the point where even I started to forget the hacks going on behind the scenes while playtesting. But the huge conflict between nav meshes was still there, just waiting to cause headaches, because nav meshes cannot be toggled with event scripts like collisions. Problem 2. A world of lies. We know FromSoft sometimes exaggerates the player's view of a distant area relative to where that area actually is in world coordinates. The Duke's Archives, for example, is not actually contained inside this pretty small tower you can see from Anor Londo, and it's not even proportionately scaled. The room where you have to die to Seath is way bigger than it looks from the outside. But these are harmless tricks of perspective that convey the overall world layout accurately. For Nightfall 1.0, this was not the case, and I can freely admit it now because it's all in the past. I was planning to deceive you big time. So many lies. All because of that same general problem. Connections between the rearranged areas of Lordran were so constraining that there was no space to create any cohesive, looping, organically interconnected world design. The odds of multiple connection points happening to line up in a way that led to looping in-game paths was essentially zero. But I absolutely did not want to transform Lordran into something linear. I wanted loops. The answer? More hacks, to try to trick the player into thinking connections were seamless when they really weren't. In the earliest build of Nightfall, version 0.5 let's say, there were literally doors that would trigger a loading screen when you tried to open them and deposit you on the quote other side, which was actually somewhere on the far side of the world. From Software, of course, does warp the player around from time to time, but this was too obvious, and I knew players would feel the break in continuity, so I asked Meowmaritus to write me an event function that could quickly reset the camera behind the player and allow me to disguise a player warp without using loading screens. Just don't ask questions about enemies mysteriously appearing and disappearing on each side. I even tried to get this working on elevators. As you'd expect, the absence of organic world loops also had an effect on scenery. In the demo, you can see the Undead Parish sitting above demon ruins, now inside the same cavern. This area isn't accessible in the demo, but in the full version of Nightfall 1.0, you would indeed later reach the parish and be able to look down into the demon ruins. Except this was all fake. In fact, the real parish is rotated by 180 degrees from what you can see in Demon Ruins, and it has its own entire rotated fake copy of Demon Ruins. There are enough twists and turns when you travel between these maps that you probably wouldn't have noticed this rotation without using a pen and paper, or just opening the map files in DS Map Studio. But even if players had noticed, and there are other cases where you would definitely notice, we had this cheap, topsy-turvy, warped world story excuse for it. Not a load-bearing piece of lore I was ever fully comfortable with, but in modding, you have to roll with the punches sometimes. Meanwhile, the very few real looping connections that existed in Nightfall 1.0 were all found and built upon through pure chance. For example, once the catacombs in Ash Lake were placed individually, it turned out that Pinwheel's coffin at the bottom of the catacombs happened to intersect the main sandbar in Ash Lake. So I wrote some events that let the player trigger a mysterious rumbling inside the coffin and secretly toggle between the catacombs and Ash Lake being drawn, giving the appearance that the entire coffin had teleported to Ash Lake, or back to the catacombs. The problem was that because this connection was pure luck, it was relegated to being a fairly useless late game bonus. It couldn't actually factor into the main progression design, which I'd carefully structured far in advance of discovering connections like this. There was a similar serendipitous connection between Seath's boss room in Crystal Cave, which by the way ploughed straight through the middle of Darkroot Garden and Undead Burg, and the old aqueduct connection between Filing Shrine and Undead Burg. I created this new ladder object just to reach from the bottom of the boss room all the way up to the aqueduct. Discovering these real connections in Nightfall 1.0 would have been kind of cool, but I basically just showed you all of them. Problem 3. MCP file equals map crash problem. So those two mysterious navigation files from before, it turns out they matter even more than we thought. The MCP file is relatively straightforward. It contains an axis-aligned box in world space, corresponding to each navmesh model. As we now understand it, the game actually casts rays from the navmesh the player is currently standing on, and checks if those rays intersect the MCP boxes of other navmeshes, including navmeshes from other maps. The boxes are here in red in debug mode. Thanks, Horkrux. If these boxes aren't properly defined and placed, it's extremely difficult to get collision from nearby maps to load. The backread system will not load the map in advance, and you basically have to walk right up to the map and hope the collision system alone can take care of it. And let me tell you, when you're making movements as big as Nightfall, that system is not enough. Meanwhile, the MCG file contains the actual navigation graph, a list of gate nodes, the green spheres here, that sit at the boundaries between the smaller nav meshes, and the green edges that join them, which include weights that help enemies decide which route to take to get to their target. Thankfully, you can view all of this data in the game's debug build and even see which triangle in the nav mesh each character is currently standing on, including the player. You can also play around with the distance of the nav mesh raycasts used to trigger the loading and unloading of other nav meshes, which is itself directly connected to loading other maps. In theory, moving an entire map somewhere else and redoing its connections shouldn't be too hard, right? Just apply some global movement to all of these boxes and meshes and green nodes in the MCP and MCG files and the nav meshes. And this worked, maybe 90% of the time. The other 10% of the time, the game would randomly crash, likely because of multiple navmesh MCP boxes placed in the same map in such a way that standing in a particular spot in a different map would cause the first map to load and unload repeatedly. I could only fix this by surgically removing seemingly random parts of nav meshes where the crashes seemed to happen. As long as the game's maps were awkwardly overlapping, the game engine was 100% going to fight me on this. Enter Soulstruct for Blender. I've had prototypes of these tools for a while, but only in the last year have they really matured into something that just kind of works most of the time. Not only for map pieces and collisions, but for nav meshes, MCP boxes, and MCG graph files as well. You've been seeing clips of this add-on throughout the video. If you're keen to try it, it's available on GitHub, and I now have a tutorial for getting started over on my personal YouTube channel. It's not perfect, but it's definitely becoming fairly polished for at least Dark Souls Remastered. I think it forms a nice complement to moving things around in the much more fully featured Dark Souls Map Studio. This year, I redesigned Nightfall's world layout from scratch, and I'm now well into the process of executing that redesign in Blender. Aside from just putting in the effort to model new maps, every single problem I've talked about in this video has disappeared. The game engine is happy that I'm no longer torturing it. The world of Nightfall 2.0 is fully cohesive, and hopefully feels a lot more like exploring the original version of Lordran for the first time. If you can see one part of the world from another, you're looking at the genuine position of that area, and you can walk there with no teleporting trickery and no Grimrukh event scripts frantically putting out fires behind the scenes. While Nightfall's world is still very much a rearrangement of Lordran at its core, it's now absolutely stuffed with detailed map changes and some new areas that will hopefully make this new version of Lordran feel as interwoven and exciting as the original. It's hard for me to express how satisfying this is from a developer point of view. And as a little bonus, here's a blurry, spoiler-free view of the entire 3D world of Nightfall, viewed along all three axes. You can see the action isn't all just taking place on one horizontal plane, and these are just the actual collision meshes you can touch, without all the extra scenery. I've focused on maps in this update, but that's largely because I felt that the old world of Nightfall had become the aspect of the project, holding everything else back. The rest of the team's efforts, particularly Meowmaritus, are still pouring into new bosses. We've all given a lot to Nightfall, but there's still a little more to give. A huge thank you as always to everyone waiting patiently for Nightfall and everyone who's supported the mod, whether it's through Patreon, to Meowmaritus or myself, or just your kind words. I know I always say this, but I will try really hard to make more frequent public updates. Given that these videos are a lot of effort, I think I'm going to switch to making more regular text updates on my website. It's been hard juggling updates alongside my day job, moving countries, and actual mod work, but it's also all too easy to forget just how much these updates help to remind the team that there are folks out there who want to see this ship of Souls lunatics successfully make it to port. So from the whole team, thank you for that, truly. Stay tuned and stay human, folks.